So you have forgiven him, but from what I read in your book and other interviews you've done, it doesn't sound like he ever apologized. And we know from testimony that he gave the impression to his top White House aides that were there when the crowd was chanting, "Hang Mike Pence," he said something along the lines of, according to testimony under oath, "Maybe they're right about you." So I come from a different faith tradition that also believes in forgiveness, but it also believes in people seeking forgiveness when they have done wrong to someone.
Well, Jake, I don't know what was happening at the White House. I was at a loading dock at the U.S. Capitol building working the problem and doing my level best to help facilitate the arrival of security personnel to quell the violence. But what I can tell you is in the 5 days following January 6th, I made no effort to contact the president. He had said the things publicly that I believe needed to be said, committing to a peaceful transfer of power, condemning the violence that had taken place. But when his daughter Ivanka and son-in-law came to my office, as I write in So Help Me God, and asked on that following Monday if I'd be willing to sit down with the president, I told them I wasn't looking for a meeting, but if he had something to say to me, I'd hear him out. And I walked down to the Oval Office that you've been to many times, into that back hallway in the small dining room where the president and I had spent so many productive hours working through issues at home and abroad, the progress that we had made for a stronger, more prosperous country. A lot of it had happened over that small dining room table. But I walked into the room and the President's Chief of Staff was present, but he quickly left. The President looked up at me and he asked if Karen and Charlotte were okay. And I said tersely, "They're fine, Mr. President." And he said, "Were you scared?" And I said, "No, I was angry. I was angry about the differences we had, and I told him seeing those people ransacking the Capitol infuriated me." But we sat for more than an hour and a half, and I was candid with the president about my disappointment. And I must tell you that I sensed the president was deeply remorseful in that moment. Now, I know that's at odds with people's public perception about him, but I want to tell you it was true. I could tell he was saddened by what had happened. And we spoke through it that day. And I encouraged him to pray. He told me many times that he was a believer, and I told him, "Well, turn to Jesus," hoping that he would find the comfort there that I was finding in that moment. In the days that followed, I made my way back in that office for another meeting, and the president, days later, was still what I would call downcast. His voice was fainter than I ever remember at any time in our 4.5 years together. And after we finished talking through some end of the administration business, I reminded him that I was praying for him. And he was dismissive about it. But as our meeting came to a close, I stood up, and he was seated at that small table. And I looked at him and I said, "I guess there's just two things we'll probably never agree on." And he looked up and said, "What?" And I referred to my role on January 6th. And then I said, "I'm never going to stop praying for you." And he smiled faintly and said, "That's right. Don't ever change." And we parted amicably as much as we could in the aftermath of those events. We spoke from time to time after we both left office. But Jake, after the president returned to the rhetoric that he was using before that tragic day in January, criticizing me and others who had taken a stand for the Constitution of the United States, I just determined it was best to go our separate ways, and we have. But I truly do believe in those moments, he was saddened by what had happened. And he conveyed that to me in ways that I'll never forget.